In a quiet suburban neighborhood of Minneapolis, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, lived Thomas and Claire Henderson. From the outside, they appeared to have it all: a beautiful house, successful careers, and a seemingly perfect life. However, the one thing missing was the pitter-patter of little feet in their home. After years of struggling with fertility issues and countless failed attempts at pregnancy, the couple finally decided to consider adoption. They spent months researching agencies, preparing their home, and getting their paperwork in order. Their hearts raced with excitement when they received the call that would change their lives forever. "We have a child who needs a loving home," the adoption agency coordinator told them over the phone. The couple's joy, however, was short-lived when they learned more details about the child, a 3-year-old boy named David, who happened to be African American. Thomas and Claire exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had always imagined adopting a child who looked like them, as they put it. Despite their professional success and outward appearance of being progressive people, deep-seated prejudices they didn't even know they harbored began to surface. "We just don't think we're equipped to handle the cultural differences," Claire explained nervously to the coordinator, while Thomas nodded in agreement. "Maybe it would be better for the child to be with a family who can better understand his background." The coordinator's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but firm. "Every child deserves a loving home, regardless of their skin color. But I understand this is a personal decision." What Thomas and Claire didn't know was that their decision would set in motion a series of events that would force them to confront their own biases and preconceptions about family, love, and what truly matters in life. As fate would have it, Claire's younger sister Amy was working as a pediatric nurse at the local children's hospital. One day, she came home in tears after caring for a young patient, a 3-year-old African American boy named David, the same child her sister and brother-in-law had rejected. David had been admitted with a minor respiratory infection, but what broke Amy's heart wasn't his illness. It was the way he would light up the entire ward with his infectious laugh, how he would share his hospital pudding with other sick children, and how he would try to comfort crying babies in nearby rooms by singing the lullabies he had learned at the orphanage. Amy couldn't keep this to herself. That evening, she visited Thomas and Claire, determined to share her experience. As she described David's resilience, kindness, and the pure joy he brought to everyone around him, she noticed something changing in her sister's expression. "You should see how he draws these incredible pictures," Amy continued, pulling out a crayon drawing David had given her. "He made this for me after I gave him his medicine. He said it was a picture of his future family, whoever they might be." The drawing showed stick figures of different colors holding hands under a rainbow. It was simple but powerful in its innocence and hope. Claire's hands trembled as she held the picture, and for the first time, she began to see past her own prejudices to the heart of what adoption truly meant. Thomas, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "We really messed up, didn't we?" His voice cracked with emotion as the reality of their actions began to sink in. The couple spent that night in deep conversation, confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and their values. As the first part of their journey drew to a close, Thomas and Claire realized they stood at a crossroads. Their comfortable life had been disrupted by a child they had never met, but who had already begun to change their hearts. Little did they know, their story was far from over, and the biggest challenges, and most beautiful rewards, still lay ahead. The weight of their decision hung heavy in their home that night, as both Thomas and Claire lay awake, their minds filled with thoughts of David and the family they could have been. The crayon drawing sat on their bedside table, a quiet reminder of the love they had turned away, and perhaps, a beacon of hope for what could still be. The following morning, Claire couldn't focus at her job as a high school counselor. Her mind kept drifting to the crayon drawing now tucked safely in her desk drawer. During her lunch break, she found herself researching transracial adoption on her computer, reading stories of families who had crossed racial boundaries to create beautiful, loving homes. Meanwhile, Thomas, a corporate lawyer, was sitting through a meeting when his colleague brought up her own adoption story. "You know," she said, "not knowing about Thomas's recent decision, my parents were terrified of adopting my brother because he was a different race. Now, 20 years later, they say their only regret was almost letting fear stop them from having him in their lives." The coincidence struck Thomas hard. He excused himself from the meeting and went to his office, where he spent the next hour looking at photos of happy multiracial families on adoption websites. Each smiling face seemed to challenge the assumptions that had led to his and Claire's decision. That evening, when both Thomas and Claire returned home, they found Amy waiting on their doorstep. She had news that would shake them to their core. "David's condition has worsened," she explained, her voice trembling. The respiratory infection revealed an underlying condition. "He needs a family now more than ever." Claire sank into their living room couch, her hand covering her mouth. "What kind of condition?" she asked, her counselor's instincts kicking in, wanting to understand everything. "It's treatable," Amy assured them, "but he needs stability, consistent medical care, and most importantly, love. The doctors are worried about his recovery in the orphanage environment." She paused, then added softly, "He asked about the family that was supposed to meet him last week. He's still hoping they'll come." Thomas and Claire exchanged glances, the weight of their previous decision becoming heavier with each passing moment. That night, they barely slept, both lost in their own thoughts about David and the life they could provide him. The next day, Claire took a personal day from work and visited the children's hospital. She stood in the doorway of David's room, watching as he sat in his bed, diligently coloring another picture despite the 4 in his small arm. A nurse was sitting with him, praising his choice of colors. "The sky can be any color you want it to be," David was saying with the wisdom only a child could possess. "Just like families can be any color too." His words, so innocent yet profound, brought tears to Claire's eyes. Without entering the room, Claire watched as David shared his crayons with another sick child in the next bed. Despite his own illness, he was focused on making his fellow patient smile. It was then that Claire realized something fundamental: love knows no color, and family is about the connections we forge, not the similarities we share. She rushed home to find Thomas already there, having left work early himself. "I can't stop thinking about him," Thomas admitted before Claire could speak. "I keep imagining him alone in that hospital room, still believing in the goodness of people despite what we did." Claire pulled out her phone and showed Thomas the video she had secretly recorded of David sharing his crayons. "Look at him," she whispered. "Look at how much love he has to give. How could we have been so blind?" Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the adoption agency. Another family had expressed interest in David. The coordinator was calling as a courtesy, given their previous interaction. The news hit Thomas and Claire like a physical blow. The possibility of losing David forever suddenly became very real. "We made a terrible mistake," Thomas said into the phone, his voice cracking. "We let our fears and prejudices cloud our judgment. Is there any way we could still be considered?" The coordinator's response was cautious but not dismissive. "This would require careful consideration. We need to be certain this isn't just a reaction to guilt or pity. David needs a family who will love him unconditionally and be prepared for the challenges that come with any adoption, including transracial adoption." Over the next few days, Thomas and Claire threw themselves into proving their commitment. They enrolled in cultural competency classes, joined support groups for transracial adoptive families, and began making connections within the local African American community. They weren't just checking boxes, they were genuinely trying to understand and prepare for the responsibility of raising a child of a different race. They also started meeting with a family therapist who specialized in adoption issues. During one session, Claire broke down as she confronted her own internalized biases. "I was so worried about what other people would think," she admitted through tears, "that I forgot to think about what really matters: giving a child a loving home." Thomas reached for her hand as he added, "We've spent our whole lives playing it safe, fitting into what society expects of us. But maybe the biggest risk would be letting those expectations stop us from creating the family we're meant to have." As part 2 drew to a close, Thomas and Claire faced their biggest challenge yet, convincing the adoption agency, and more importantly, proving to themselves that they were ready for this life-changing step. The journey ahead would test their commitment, challenge their growth, and ultimately reveal whether love truly could overcome the barriers they had once placed in its way. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Thomas and Claire worked tirelessly to prove their commitment to adopting David. They transformed their home office into a child's bedroom, filling it with books featuring diverse characters and artwork celebrating different cultures. Each addition to the room felt like a step toward healing their past mistake. During one of their cultural competency classes, they met Richard and Lisa Thompson, an interracial couple who had been married for 20 years. After class, over coffee, Richard shared his perspective. "It won't always be easy," he said, stirring his drink thoughtfully. "People will stare, make comments, ask inappropriate questions. But let me tell you something, when you truly love your child, those things become background noise." Lisa added, "The key is to create a support system. Your child needs to see people who look like them in their life, not just in books or on TV." She paused, then offered, "If you're serious about this, we'd be happy to be part of that support system." Claire found herself tearing up at their kindness. Here were strangers willing to help them, despite knowing about their initial rejection of David. It was a humbling reminder of how much they still had to learn about true acceptance and community. Meanwhile, David's health was improving, but he still needed regular medical attention. Amy kept them updated on his progress, sharing how he would ask the nurses to save their medical gloves so he could blow them up like balloons for the other children. His resilience and generosity continued to touch everyone around him. One afternoon, while Thomas was picking up some paperwork from the adoption agency, he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. The other family interested in David had withdrawn their application. His heart raced as he approached the coordinator's desk, but her expression was guarded. "Yes, the other family is no longer in consideration," she confirmed. "But Thomas, we need to be absolutely certain about your intentions. David has already faced rejection once, we can't risk that happening again." Thomas stood straighter, his voice firm. "I know our initial response was wrong. We've spent every day since then working to educate ourselves and prepare for the responsibility of being David's parents. We're not the same people who sat in these chairs a month ago." The coordinator studied him for a long moment before pulling out a thick folder. "We've noticed your efforts," she said. "The cultural competency classes, the support group meetings, the home preparations. But more importantly, we've seen the genuine change in your attitudes and understanding." She handed him a document. "This is a preliminary approval for you and Claire to meet David. It's not a final placement decision, but it's a start. Remember, David's well-being comes first. Any interaction needs to be gradual and mindful of his current health condition." Thomas could barely contain his excitement as he called Claire with the news. She was in the middle of a counseling session but excused herself when she saw his call. As she listened to him, tears streamed down her face. Her students, watching through the office window, had never seen their normally composed counselor so emotional. The next day, they had their first official meeting with David. They brought small gifts, a stuffed giraffe, his favorite animal, they'd learned from Amy, and a new set of crayons. As they approached his hospital room, both Thomas and Claire felt their hearts pounding. David was sitting up in bed, working on another drawing. When they entered, he looked up with those bright, curious eyes that had haunted their dreams for weeks. "Are you the family that changed their mind?" he asked directly, with the unfiltered honesty of a child. Claire felt her throat tighten, but she knew they owed him complete honesty. "Yes, we are," she said softly. "We made a mistake before, but we've learned a lot since then. We'd like to get to know you, if that's okay. David studied them for a moment, then pointed to the empty chairs near his bed. Do you want to color with me? I'm drawing a garden where all the flowers are different colors but they grow together because that's what makes the garden beautiful. Thomas and Claire sat down, accepting the crayons he offered them. As they colored together, David shared stories about his favorite nurses, his dreams of having a dog someday, and his hope of being well enough to play outside again soon. The hour they spent with him passed too quickly. As they prepared to leave, David handed them his completed drawing. This is for your fridge, he said matter-of-factly. All families need drawings on their fridge. That simple statement, all families, hit them hard. In David's mind, despite their initial rejection, despite their differences, they could still be a family. His capacity for forgiveness and acceptance was teaching them more than any class or support group ever could. As they left the hospital that day, Claire clutched the drawing to her chest. We don't deserve his forgiveness, she whispered to Thomas. But we're going to spend every day working to be worthy of it. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders. That's exactly what family is about, he replied. Not deserving love, but choosing to give it anyway. David's already showing us that. The drawing found its place on their refrigerator that evening, the first of what they hoped would be many family mementos. But as part 3 of their journey came to a close, they knew the real challenges still lay ahead. Building trust would take time, and proving their commitment would require more than just good intentions. The path to becoming a family would test them in ways they never expected, but for the first time, they were truly ready to face those challenges together. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Claire fell into a routine of visiting David every day after work. They would bring new books to read together, play board games, or simply sit and talk. With each visit, the awkwardness melted away, replaced by genuine connection and growing affection. One afternoon, while Claire was reading David's favorite book about a little engine that never gave up, she noticed him watching her face more than looking at the pictures. Why do your eyes crinkle when you smile? He asked suddenly. Mine don't do that. The question caught Claire off guard, but she remembered what she'd learned in their cultural competency classes about addressing differences openly and honestly. Everyone's faces are unique, she explained. Just like how your eyes are beautiful and bright, and your smile lights up the whole room in its own special way. David seemed to consider this for a moment before adding, and just like how Thomas's hair is different from mine. He reached up to touch his own curly hair, then pointed to Thomas's straight hair. Thomas moved closer to the bed. That's right, he said warmly. And you know what? I think your hair is amazing. Would you like to teach me how to take care of it properly? The genuine interest in Thomas's voice made David beam with pride. The next day, they arranged for a visit from Mrs. Washington, a local African-American hairstylist recommended by the Thompsons. She spent an hour showing Thomas and Claire proper hair care techniques while David watched in the mirror, offering his own commentary and giggling when Thomas practiced too gently. You have to be firm but gentle, Mrs. Washington instructed, guiding Thomas's hands. Just like raising a child, it takes the right balance. Her words carried a deeper meaning that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. As David's health continued to improve, the doctors began discussing his release from the hospital. This brought new challenges and considerations for Thomas and Claire. They scheduled several meetings with the adoption agency to discuss the next steps, each one bringing them closer to their goal of becoming David's parents. During one such meeting, the coordinator asked David how he felt about potentially living with Thomas and Claire. His response brought tears to everyone's eyes. They made a mistake, he said simply, but they came back. Nobody ever came back for me before. The wisdom in his young voice struck deep into Thomas and Claire's hearts. They had indeed come back, but David's words reminded them that their journey was about more than just correcting a mistake, it was about building trust that would last a lifetime. One evening, as they were preparing to leave after their daily visit, David grabbed Claire's hand. "When can I see your house?" he asked. "The one with my drawing on the fridge?" Claire looked at Thomas, then at the nurse who had been overseeing David's care. The nurse smiled and nodded. "His latest tests look good. We could arrange a short home visit this weekend, with medical supervision of course." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Thomas and Claire deep cleaned their house, double-checked the safety measures they'd installed, and made sure David's room was perfect. They sought advice from their support group about making their home welcoming for a child who had spent most of his life in institutions. When the big day arrived, David walked into their house holding both their hands, his eyes wide with wonder. He explored each room carefully, asking questions about everything he saw. In the kitchen, he stopped in front of the refrigerator, staring at his drawing. "You really kept it," he whispered, reaching out to touch the paper. "Of course we did," Claire replied, kneeling beside him. "It's our first family artwork." David's exploration led them to his room, where he stood in the doorway, mouth open in surprise. The walls were painted a soft blue, his favorite color, and decorated with positive images reflecting diverse families and cultures. A bookshelf held stories featuring characters of all backgrounds, and a special corner was set up with art supplies. "Is this, for me?" he asked, his voice small with disbelief. "All of it," Thomas confirmed. "We've been getting it ready, hoping you'd like it." David walked slowly around the room, touching everything gently as if afraid it might disappear. He stopped at the window seat they'd created, complete with comfortable cushions and a view of the backyard. "Can I sit here and draw?" "Anytime you want," Claire assured him. "This is your space." As David settled onto the window seat, pulling out the crayons they'd placed there, he looked more at home than they'd ever seen him. The nurse who had accompanied them watched from the doorway, making notes but smiling at the scene. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to take David back to the hospital, he asked the question they'd been hoping for: "When can I come here for real? To stay?" Thomas and Claire looked at each other, then at the nurse and the social worker who had accompanied them. The social worker stepped forward. "Well, David, if everything continues to go well with your health, and if you're sure this is what you want, we could start transitioning you to living here permanently very soon." David's face lit up with the brightest smile they'd ever seen. "I want to," he said firmly. "They came back for me. They learned about my hair, and they keep my drawings, and they made me a room with a special place to draw. That's what families do, right?" As part 4 drew to a close, Thomas and Claire realized that their journey of redemption was transforming into something even more beautiful, the natural evolution of a family finding its way together. Their earlier prejudices seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the pure joy of watching their son, for that's how they had begun to think of him, discover his place in their home and their hearts. The transition process began with overnight stays at Thomas and Claire's house, gradually increasing in duration as David's health improved. Each successful visit brought them closer to their goal of becoming a permanent family, but it also presented new challenges and learning opportunities. During one of David's first overnight stays, a thunderstorm swept through the area. The loud crashes sent him running from his new room into the hallway, trembling. Claire found him there, curled up in a ball, trying to be as quiet as possible. "I don't like storms," he whispered when she knelt beside him. "At the orphanage, I would hide under my bed, but I didn't want to mess up my new room." Claire's heart ached at his words. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, opening her arms. "You never have to hide alone anymore. Would you like to know what my family did during storms when I was little?" David nodded, cautiously moving closer to her. Claire led him to the living room, where she began gathering blankets and pillows. Thomas, who had heard the commotion, joined them with hot chocolate and cookies. "We're going to build a storm fort," Claire announced, showing David how to drape blankets over chairs to create a cozy shelter. As they worked together, each thunder crash seemed less frightening. Soon, they were all snuggled inside their fort, sharing stories and feeling safe together. "This is much better than hiding alone," David declared, clutching his hot chocolate with both hands. It was a simple moment, but one that marked a significant step in their bonding as a family. The following week brought another milestone when Thomas and Claire attended their first parent-teacher conference at the hospital's educational program. David's teacher, Mrs. Chen, shared his progress reports and artwork, praising his creativity and resilience. However, she added carefully, "I've noticed he's been drawing a lot of pictures lately about his fear of being sent away. It's common for children in his situation to worry about permanence." That evening, Thomas and Claire had a heart-to-heart conversation with David about his fears. "I keep thinking maybe you'll change your mind again," he admitted, playing with the edge of his blanket. Like before. Thomas felt the familiar pang of regret but knew they had to address this head-on. "We made a terrible mistake before," he acknowledged. "But do you know what? That mistake taught us something very important. It taught us that love is stronger than fear, and that families can look different from what we expected." Claire added, "We're not just promising to be your parents, David. We're promising to keep learning, keep growing, and keep working to be the best family we can be, together." David thought about this for a moment. "Can we pinky promise?" he asked, holding out his little finger. They linked their fingers together, making the most solemn of childhood vows, their different skin tones intertwined in a perfect symbol of their growing bond. As David's health continued to improve, they began venturing out more into the community. Their first trip to the local playground brought both joy and challenges. While David was excitedly climbing on the equipment, they overheard another parent making an insensitive comment about their family. Before either Thomas or Claire could respond, David called out, "Mom! Dad! Watch me go down the big slide." It was the first time he had called them Mom and Dad, and the moment was so perfect that the stranger's words became meaningless. Later that evening, as they discussed the incident with their support group, Richard and Lisa Thompson reminded them that such moments would be part of their journey. "The key," Lisa explained, "is to build David's confidence in his identity and in your family's love. The rest is just noise." The support group had become an essential part of their lives, providing guidance and friendship. Through these connections, David was meeting other children from transracial adoptive families, helping him understand that families come in many beautiful combinations. One particularly memorable day came when they attended a cultural festival organized by their support group. David was fascinated by the African drums, and his eyes lit up when one of the performers invited him to try playing. Thomas and Claire watched as their son, initially shy, began to bloom under the gentle guidance of the drummer. "You've got rhythm in your blood, little man," the drummer told him, and David beamed with pride. Later, he asked if he could take drum lessons, marking the first time he'd felt confident enough to request something significant for himself. "Of course you can," Thomas replied, already researching local instructors on his phone. "We want you to explore and celebrate every part of who you are." As they worked through the final stages of the adoption process, their home became filled with more and more signs of their life together. David's artwork covered not just the refrigerator but the walls of their home office. Family photos began to appear, capturing their growing bond, David and Claire baking cookies, Thomas teaching David to ride a bike, all three of them covered in paint after decorating David's room together. One evening, as Claire was tucking David into bed, he asked a question that showed just how far they'd come. "Do you think when I grow up, I could help other kids find their forever families? Even if they look different from the parents?" Claire hugged him tightly, fighting back tears. "I think that's a beautiful idea," she said. "You know better than most that love doesn't care about what people look like." As Part 5 drew to a close, Thomas and Claire realized that their journey had become about so much more than correcting a past mistake. Through David, they were learning daily lessons about love, courage, and the true meaning of family. Their house had transformed from a perfectly manicured showcase into a real home, complete with crayon marks on the walls and toys scattered across the floor. And they wouldn't have it any other way. As summer approached, the family faced an unexpected challenge when they received an invitation to the annual Henderson family reunion. Thomas's extended family had always been traditional in their views, and some members had expressed disapproval when they learned about David's adoption. "We don't have to go," Thomas told Claire one evening after David had gone to bed. But Claire shook her head, remembering their commitment to never hide or apologize for their family. "Running away won't change anything," she said firmly. "Besides, David needs to know that we're proud of him and our family, no matter what anyone else thinks." They prepared David for the reunion carefully, talking openly about how some people might not understand their family right away. "But that's their problem, not ours," Thomas explained, watching David practice his drumming. The lessons had become a source of joy and confidence for their son. The day of the reunion arrived bright and sunny. As they pulled up to the large park where the gathering was held, David squeezed their hands tightly. "Remember," Claire whispered, "you're a Henderson now, and Hendersons stick together." The initial reaction from some family members was exactly as they'd feared: awkward silences, pointed looks, and whispered conversations. But David, with his natural charm and resilience, began to break down barriers simply by being himself. It started when he helped Thomas's elderly grandmother, who had dropped her plate of food. Without hesitation, David rushed to help her, carefully picking up the scattered items and offering to get her a new plate. His genuine kindness touched the old woman's heart. "Come sit with me, young man," she patted the chair next to her. "Tell me about those drum lessons your father mentioned." The way she naturally referred to Thomas as David's father didn't go unnoticed by the watching relatives. Throughout the day, David's infectious laugh and helpful nature won over more and more family members. He taught his younger cousins the rhythm games he'd learned in his drum classes, shared his art supplies with everyone, and told stories about his awesome parents to anyone who would listen. The turning point came when Thomas's uncle Robert, known for his conservative views, watched David comfort his own daughter after she fell and scraped her knee. The gentle way David helped her up, shared his special bandage from his pocket, he always carried them since his hospital days, and made her smile through her tears seemed to shift something in the older man's perspective. Later, Robert approached Thomas and Claire. "I owe you both an apology," he said gruffly. "I was wrong about a lot of things. That boy of yours, he's something special." By the end of the reunion, David had collected phone numbers from cousins who wanted to stay in touch, promises of play dates, and even an invitation to teach drum lessons to some of the younger children. The family that had once been hesitant to accept him was now embracing him fully. On the drive home, David was quiet, processing the day's events. Finally, he spoke up from the back seat. "Some people looked at us funny at first," he observed. "But then they saw we were a real family, right?" "That's right," Claire answered, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes people need time to understand that love is what makes a family real, not how we look." The success at the family reunion gave them confidence to become more involved in their community. They started attending different cultural events, not just as observers but as active participants. David's drum instructor, Mr. Johnson, had become a close family friend and cultural mentor, helping them understand and celebrate David's heritage. One Saturday, while they were at a community festival where David was performing with his drum group, they ran into the adoption agency coordinator who had initially worked with them. She watched in amazement as David confidently performed his solo, Thomas and Claire cheering loudly from the front row. "I have to admit," she told them afterward, "when you came back asking for a second chance, I was skeptical. But seeing you all together now, this is exactly what we hope for in adoption." Their story began to spread through the adoption community. Other families considering transracial adoption started reaching out to them for advice and support. Claire and Thomas found themselves sharing their journey openly, acknowledging their initial mistakes and the valuable lessons they'd learned. They started a support group specifically for families who had overcome similar prejudices and fears. "We're not experts," Claire would tell new members, "we're just parents who learned that love is more powerful than fear." David took pride in helping other kids adjust to their new families. At one support group meeting, he sat with a newly adopted girl who was feeling shy and nervous. "You know what?" he told her, "my parents made a mistake once too, but they came back because love is stronger than mistakes. And now we're a real family." The girl's adoptive parents, hearing this, approached Thomas and Claire later. "Your son gave our daughter hope today," they said. "She's been so worried about fitting in, but seeing your family and hearing David's story really helped her." As summer turned to fall, they celebrated the official one-year anniversary of David's adoption. They threw a party that brought together their entire extended support system: family members, friends from the support group, David's drum teacher, medical staff from his hospital stay, and even Mrs. Washington, who still did his hair. During the celebration, David presented his parents with a special gift, a large canvas he'd painted in art class. It showed 3 figures holding hands under a rainbow, much like his first crayon drawing, but this time with detailed faces and a house in the background. At the bottom, he'd written, "Love makes a family." As part 6 came to a close, Thomas and Claire realized that their journey had rippled out far beyond their own family. Their story had become a beacon of hope for others, proving that people could change, that love could overcome prejudice, and that families could thrive regardless of how they looked. David, their son who had taught them so much about love and acceptance, was growing into a confident, compassionate young boy who understood that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from unexpected second chances. As David entered his first year of regular school, Thomas and Claire faced new challenges and opportunities. The private school they'd chosen had a strong commitment to diversity and inclusion, but they were still one of the few transracial families in the community. During the first parent-teacher conference, David's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, shared something remarkable. "David has become a natural leader in our classroom," she explained, showing them his projects and assignments. "When new students join us, especially those who feel different or out of place, he's always the first to make them feel welcome." She pulled out a journal entry David had written. The assignment was to describe a hero, and David had written about his parents. "My mom and dad showed me that people can change and learn," he'd written in his careful handwriting. "They taught me that it's okay to make mistakes if you learn from them and try to fix them. That makes them my heroes." Reading those words, Claire had to excuse herself from the conference room for a moment to compose herself. Thomas found her in the hallway, wiping tears from her eyes. "How did we get so lucky?" she whispered. "After what we did, how did we end up with such an amazing child?" "We're the ones who learned the most important lessons," Thomas replied, holding her hand. "David taught us more about love and acceptance than we could ever teach him." Their family's story began to attract attention beyond their immediate community. A local newspaper wrote an article about their support group and its impact on families considering transracial adoption. The story focused on how their initial rejection and subsequent change of heart had sparked a movement of understanding and acceptance in their community. The article caught the attention of a national adoption advocacy organization, which invited them to speak at their annual conference. At first, Thomas and Claire were hesitant. Sharing their story meant publicly acknowledging their initial prejudice. "What do you think, David?" they asked him one evening. "How would you feel about us telling our story to help other families?" David looked up from his homework, considering the question seriously. "Remember when you told me that sometimes the best way to fix a mistake is to help others not make the same one?" he asked. "Maybe that's what we should do." With David's blessing, they agreed to speak at the conference. They worked together as a family to prepare their presentation, with David contributing his own perspectives through artwork and recorded video messages. The conference room was packed when they took the stage. Claire began their story with raw honesty. "We're here today because we almost missed out on the greatest gift of our lives due to our own prejudice and fear." As they shared their journey, they could see their words impacting the audience. Some people wiped away tears, while others nodded in recognition of their own biases and fears. But the most powerful moment came when they played David's video message. "Sometimes people are scared of differences because they don't understand them," David said in the recording. "But differences are what make life interesting. Like in music, if all the drums played the same beat, it wouldn't be as beautiful as when different rhythms come together." After their presentation, numerous couples approached them, sharing their own fears and doubts about transracial adoption. One couple admitted they had recently declined to consider a child of a different race, but their story had made them reconsider their decision. "If you'd told us 3 years ago that we'd be standing here today, helping other families overcome their prejudices, we wouldn't have believed it," Thomas told them. "But love has a way of changing everything, if you let it." The conference led to more speaking engagements and opportunities to share their story. They were careful to always present it as a family decision, including David in every step of the process. He began creating artwork and short videos to accompany their presentations, sharing his perspective on family, love, and acceptance. Their advocacy work led to partnerships with adoption agencies across the country, helping to develop programs that addressed racial bias and fear in potential adoptive parents. Claire used her experience as a school counselor to create workshops for families struggling with similar issues. One evening, after returning from a particularly impactful speaking event, they found David in his room, working on a special art project. He had created a series of portraits of different families, some with parents and children who looked alike, others with visible differences, but all clearly bound by love. "It's for the new families," he explained. "So they can see that families don't have to match on the outside to match on the inside." The artwork became part of their presentation materials, and copies were displayed in adoption agencies across the country. David's simple but powerful message resonated with countless families beginning their own adoption journeys. As their influence grew, they never forgot the personal nature of their mission. They continued hosting local support group meetings, maintaining the intimate, caring environment that had helped so many families, including their own. During one such meeting, a new couple shared their story of recently backing out of a transracial adoption due to fear. Instead of judgment, they found understanding and support. David, who often helped serve snacks at these meetings, approached them with cookies and wisdom beyond his years. "My parents were scared too," he told them. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Sometimes love is bigger than fear." The couple later told Thomas and Claire that David's words had given them the courage to reconsider their decision. 6 months later, they returned to the support group with their newly adopted daughter, adding another chapter to the ripple effect of change their family had started. As Part 7 drew to a close, Thomas and Claire reflected on how far they had come from that first phone call with the adoption agency. Their personal journey of overcoming prejudice had transformed not only their lives but had touched countless others. Through their story, other families were finding the courage to confront their own biases and open their hearts to love in all its forms. 5 years had passed since that life-changing decision, and the Henderson family was gathering for a very special celebration, David's Adoption Day anniversary. The backyard was filled with people whose lives had been touched by their story, families from their support group, healthcare workers who had cared for David, teachers, friends, and relatives. The celebration had become an annual tradition, but this year was different. David, now 10 years old, had asked to give a speech. As he stood before the crowd, holding note cards in slightly trembling hands, Thomas and Claire felt their hearts swell with pride. "When I was little," David began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I used to think that families had to match, like socks in a drawer. But then I learned that the best families are more like a garden, different flowers growing together, making something beautiful. He paused, looking at his parents with a smile. My mom and dad taught me that love is stronger than fear, and that sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the best things in life. They also taught me that it's not about being perfect, it's about growing and learning together. The crowd listened intently as David shared his perspective on their journey. He talked about the drum lessons that had connected him to his heritage, the family reunions that had taught him about acceptance, and the support group meetings where he'd helped other kids feel less alone. Now I know that family isn't about looking the same, he continued. It's about loving each other, standing up for each other, and sometimes being brave enough to change. My parents were brave enough to change, and that changed everything. As David spoke, Claire noticed several new faces in the crowd, prospective adoptive parents who had recently joined their support group. She saw them wiping away tears, their hands clasped together, perhaps seeing their own possible future in David's words. After the speech, Thomas shared some news with the gathering. The adoption agency they had worked with was implementing a new program, the Second Chance Initiative, inspired by their family's story. The program would provide additional support and counseling for prospective parents struggling with racial biases or fears about transracial adoption. Our story could have ended with that first phone call, Thomas said, his arm around David's shoulders. Instead, it became a beginning, not just for us, but for many other families. Claire then announced another surprise. With David's help, they had created a children's book about their journey, illustrated with his artwork. The book, titled Love Makes a Family, would be distributed to adoption agencies and libraries across the country. We want other kids to know that families can look different ways, David explained, showing everyone the cover he had designed. And we want parents to know that it's okay to be scared at first, as long as you let love be stronger than fear. The celebration continued into the evening, with families sharing stories, children playing together, and new connections being formed. The Thompsons, who had been such an important part of their journey, watched with satisfaction as their prediction about love overcoming prejudice proved true yet again. Later that night, as the party wound down, David found a quiet moment with his parents on their favorite spot, the back porch swing. Do you ever think about that day? He asked. The day you first said no? Thomas and Claire exchanged glances. They had always been honest with David about their journey, believing that the truth of their transformation was as important as the outcome. We think about it often, Claire admitted. It reminds us of how much we've grown, and how much we could have lost. It also reminds us to be humble, Thomas added. And to never take our family for granted. David nodded thoughtfully. I'm glad you changed your minds, he said simply. But I'm even more glad that you help other people change their minds too. A comfortable silence fell between them as they swayed gently on the swing, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The sounds of the last party guests leaving drifted through the air, along with the distant rhythm of drums from a CD playing in David's room upstairs. You know what? David said suddenly. I think sometimes the best families are the ones that have to work harder to find each other. Because then you know for sure it's real love, not just something that happened by accident. Claire pulled him close, marveling at the wisdom in her son's words. When did you get so smart? She asked, kissing the top of his head. I learned from the best, he replied with a grin. From parents who were brave enough to learn too. As the final part of their story drew to a close, the Henderson family sat together under the stars, their hearts full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. Their story had begun with a moment of fear and prejudice, but it had blossomed into something much greater, a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of second chances, and the true meaning of family. In their community and beyond, they had become living proof that change was possible, that love could overcome fear, and that the most beautiful families often came in unexpected packages. Their journey had not only transformed their own lives but had created ripples of change that would continue to touch lives for years to come. And it all began with a second chance, a moment of courage to admit a mistake and open their hearts to love in its purest form. Their story served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with love at first sight, but with love that grows through understanding, acceptance, and the willingness to change.